Welcome back to the deep dive. You guys always bring us the good stuff to really think about, and this time is no exception. We're diving into some pretty crucial, sometimes sticky territory this time.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Professional ethics for psychologists.
Oh, yeah.
And specifically, we're zeroing in on these concepts, I'm sure you've heard of them, multiple relationships and conflicts of interest. And I know these can be a bit of a minefield, right?
Yeah, you can say that again.
So consider this deep dive, your cheat sheet, to really understanding what's kosher and where the lines get blurry, ethically speaking. We're going to be pulling wisdom from excerpts from a document that really tackles this head on. And it all boils down to grasping that delicate balance when your professional life, it kind of bleeds into your personal world, right? Those lines can get crossed.
It really is about finding that balance, isn't it? It's fascinating because good intentions can sometimes lead to ethically ambiguous situations. And, the guidelines aren't always crystal clear, black and white. There's this layer of nuance that really requires careful consideration.
So let's jump right in. Let's tackle this big one right off the bat, multiple relationships.
Yeah.
I mean, when you hear that term, it sounds pretty straightforward, right? Like,
Yeah.
they're your patient, that's the relationship, end of story. But clearly, it goes a bit deeper than that, right?
It does. And thankfully, we have our trusty source material to help us navigate this. There's a pretty clear definition right from Ethics Code Standard 3.05. It lays it out pretty clearly. A multiple relationship, what they're talking about is, when a psychologist is in a professional role with someone and at the same time has another type of relationship with that very same person.
Gotcha.
So this could also include situations where a psychologist is in a relationship with someone closely connected to their client.
Always.
Or even, get this, even if they promise to enter into a different kind of relationship with the client in the future.
Oh, wow. Okay. So that's interesting. So I guess if you bump into your client at the coffee shop, that doesn't automatically qualify as a multiple relationship.
Exactly. You're getting it.
Okay.
It's not about the simple act of crossing paths outside the therapy room. The real meat of the issue, and this is where it gets really interesting, is that the ethics code, it specifically states that, listen to this, not all multiple relationships are unethical, right? It's a really important point to make right from the get-go.
Absolutely, yeah. So then when does it become a no-no? What's the big red flag that screams this multiple relationship is a problem?
The crux of the matter is whether that multiple relationship, that second relationship we're talking about, could reasonably be expected to impair the psychologist's objectivity, competence, or effectiveness. Think about it. Could this second relationship in any way negatively affect the psychologist's ability to do their job properly? That's the question. The other thing to watch out for is if this extra relationship puts the client at risk of exploitation or harm. Those are the big no-nos. If those risks aren't there or they're not something you could reasonably foresee, then the multiple relationship isn't automatically considered unethical.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So it's not just about the fact that there's more than one connection. It's about the potential for things to get messy, for those boundaries to get blurred.
You got it.
Now, something that our source material brings up, and I found this really interesting, is this idea of context. They specifically talk about psychologists working in rural communities. And I think that's such an important example to bring in. Can you tell us more about that?
You're right. That is a fascinating example. It really highlights how these ethical ideals can clash with real-world limitations. In smaller towns, those more isolated communities, it might be almost impossible for a psychologist to entirely avoid interacting with clients outside of their practice. I mean, they might end up at the same community events, their kids might be in the same after-school activities, stuff like that. And our source even points out that sometimes the psychologist might even have to, get this, rely on a current or former client for some essential services, simply because they're the only game in town.
Right, yeah. It's not like you can just say, oh, sorry, I can't let you fix my car. You used to come to my practice. And what are you going to do?
Precisely. The ethics code actually acknowledges this reality. In those situations, those unavoidable multiple relationships, they're not automatically labeled as violations. But, and this is a big but, it comes with a condition. They have to take special precautions. It really emphasizes the need for careful thought and proactive measures to keep those potential risks in check, both for the client's well-being and the psychologist's ability to stay objective.
I see. So it's about being extra vigilant, setting those crystal clear boundaries, even when your lives are intertwined in other ways outside of the therapy room, right?
Exactly. It's about the psychologist being super mindful of any power imbalance and ensuring that even though these connections exist, the professional relationship remains the primary focus when they're in that therapeutic setting.
Now, let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about a context where the rules seem a lot stricter, shall we say. Forensic psychology. Our source material highlights what they call a heightened standard there. Why is forensic psychology held to such a higher standard?
The forensic world, it comes with its own set of complexities, that's for sure. Ethics Code Standard 3.05c and the specialty guidelines for forensic psychology, they really stress the importance of having very well-defined professional roles. Because in forensic settings, things can get tricky. Psychologists might be asked to wear multiple hats, so to speak.
I
So,
see.
instance, they might be evaluating someone's competency to stand trial, and then later on, potentially providing therapy to that same individual.
Right, yeah. Talk about blurring the lines. That sounds like a recipe for confusion,
Yeah.
right?
It definitely can be. And the guidelines are pretty clear on this. They say that psychologists, they should only take on these dual roles in forensic settings when it's unavoidable. Like if it's a legal requirement, an institutional policy, or some really extraordinary circumstances. Otherwise, it's a big no-no. The preference is to avoid those situations whenever humanly possible.
Okay, so let's say it can't be avoided. What needs to happen then? What are the, mandatory steps?
In those unavoidable cases, the psychologist absolutely has to take certain actions. They need to spell it out for everyone involved, explain each role they're going to be playing, and be super clear about confidentiality. What information will be shared, who's going to see it, and in what context. Transparency is key here.
Right. And the source also mentioned something about referring the case to a different professional in those situations, if possible, right?
Exactly. Paragraph 4.2.01 in the specialty guidelines, it encourages forensic practitioners to lay out those potential risks of taking on dual roles and to make a real effort to refer the request to another qualified provider. Ideally, you want different professionals handling those distinct roles just to minimize any chance of conflicts or bias creeping in.
So what if referring the case just isn't an option? What if there's nobody else available?
Well, if referral isn't feasible, the psychologist has a pretty heavy ethical burden on their shoulders. They really have to weigh those potential risks and benefits for everyone involved, carefully considering all angles. Even when navigating this tricky territory, the ultimate goal is to minimize the potential negative effects of juggling those dual roles. This whole thing really underscores how seriously these situations are taken in forensic contexts.
Right. The stakes are high. So with multiple relationships, we've been talking about this direct interaction, wearing different hats with the same person or someone closely linked to them. Now let's broaden the scope a bit. Let's talk about conflicts of interest. And our source makes it clear that this isn't just about the relationship itself, it's a bigger concept. How do they define conflicts of interest?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Standard 3.06, it defines a conflict of interest as a situation where a psychologist has to step back. They have to refrain from taking on a professional role when their personal, scientific, professional, legal, financial, or other interests or relationships could reasonably be expected to, 1, impair their objectivity, competence, or effectiveness in performing their functions as a psychologist, or 2, expose the person or organization with whom the professional relationship exists to harm or exploitation.
Quite a mouthful, right?
Right, but I think I'm starting to get it. So it's less about juggling multiple roles with the same person and more about those outside factors, those things that could cloud their judgment or, tip the scales in terms of power. You nailed it. It's about situations where the psychologist's own interests, whatever those might be, could potentially get in the way of their professional duties, their responsibilities to the client or to the organization they're working with.
I see. So the source gives a couple of pretty clear-cut examples to illustrate this. Should we unpack those?
Let's do it. The first one they bring up, it's about this, well, let's call it a problematic practice. It's when a psychologist provides expert testimony, but their payment, it hinges on the outcome of the case. Like they only get paid if their side wins.
Okay, I'm seeing where this is going.
You see the issue, right? If your paycheck as an expert witness depends on your side winning, can you really truly offer unbiased testimony? That contingent fee arrangement, it creates an inherent conflict, it skews things, it gets in the way of that pure pursuit of truth.
Right, the incentive is it's inherently biased.
Right.
Okay, so what was the other example?
The other one is this. Picture a psychologist who's recommending mental health services, but those services are provided by a company that the psychologist co-owns. Ah, okay. I see the conflict there.
Right. It's a classic financial conflict of interest. The psychologist has a vested interest in steering clients towards their own company, and that could easily overshadow a more objective assessment of the client's needs.
And potentially even limit the client's access to a wider range of services that might be a better fit.
Precisely. Their recommendation, it might be driven by their own desire for financial gain, rather than what's truly in the best interest of the client.
So the bottom line here is about steering clear of situations where your own self-interest could influence your professional judgment, potentially at the expense of the client.
You're getting it. The fundamental principle, the one that should always guide these decisions, is prioritizing the client's well-being and their best interests above any other competing concerns. Okay, now the document introduces this really helpful framework for evaluating, whether a multiple relationship is ethically sound. It's attributed to Gottlieb back in 1993. This sounds like a really handy tool for dissecting these situations, which, let's be honest, can be pretty complex. Can you break down the main components of Gottlieb's model?
Absolutely. So Gottlieb's model gives us this structured way to think through the potential risks involved in multiple relationships. And he does this by focusing on three key factors. First up is the power differential. This is all about asking how much of a difference is there in the level of influence between the psychologist and the other person? Like, how much sway does the psychologist hold? And the source points out the more influence the psychologist has over that individual, the more ethically questionable that multiple relationship becomes. Think of Gottlieb's model as a three-legged stool: power differential, duration, and termination. And if any one of those legs is wonky, the whole thing becomes unstable.
I love that analogy. It really brings it home. So it's about recognizing that potential for the psychologist to, maybe even unintentionally, exploit that power imbalance.
Exactly. It goes right to the heart of that vulnerability that's often present in professional relationships. The second leg of the stool, that's the duration of the relationship. This one is about the length of that professional relationship, or even the potential length of any future multiple relationship. And the longer either of those relationships lasts, the more ethically problematic that multiple relationship becomes.
I can see that. Longer relationships, they tend to build up more layers, more shared history,
Right.
which could make it harder to maintain those clear professional boundaries.
Right. It just increases the chances of overlap and of past interactions influencing the current or future relationship in ways that might not be ideal. And that brings us to the third and final leg of Gottlieb's stool, the clarity of termination. This is all about how likely it is that the individual will need to seek professional services again in the future. If there's a good chance that that professional relationship might be rekindled, then any new, different relationship with that person becomes less acceptable from an ethical standpoint.
Yeah, that makes sense. If the door is always open for that professional relationship to start up again, then any other kind of relationship could be seen as a continuation or an overlap that could affect objectivity down the line.
Exactly. It all hinges on whether the professional relationship has truly ended and if everyone is clear that it's not going to be rekindled in the same way.
So our source material provides a real-world example to show how this framework plays out in practice. And they offer up a scenario that could actually be considered ethically acceptable. Can you
Yeah.
walk us through that example?
Yeah, absolutely. Gottlieb, he presents this situation where a psychologist might think about becoming friends with the parents of a child they helped through a painful but non-recurring medical procedure, something with a very definite endpoint. So let's dissect this using those three factors we talked about.
Okay, right.
Initially, the psychologist held a lot of power. They were in that professional role, and the parents were in this vulnerable position, going through a tough time. But that power dynamic, it was temporary, it was limited to that specific period, and the termination of the professional relationship, it was very clear cut. The medical procedure ended, it wasn't going to happen again.
Okay, so high power initially, but for a short period and with a very clear endpoint. What about the friendship that develops later?
That potential friendship, while we don't know how long it'll last or how it'll end, there's very little power differential there. The parents are no longer in that vulnerable, dependent position that they were in as clients. So when we apply the model, because that initial power imbalance was temporary and it was resolved, and the new relationship is more on an equal footing, this multiple relationship could potentially be considered ethically acceptable.
That's such a great example. It really clarifies that it's not about shutting down all other connections. It's about carefully examining the power dynamics, the timeline, and the chances of future professional interactions.
Exactly. It's about a thoughtful, nuanced assessment of the specific situation and the potential for any negative impact.
So, to wrap things up for you, our listener, what are the key takeaways from this deep dive into multiple relationships and conflicts of interest in psychology?
The big things to remember are threefold. First, not all overlapping relationships between a psychologist and their clients or people connected to them are automatically unethical. Second, context is crucial. The ethical considerations you'd have in a tight-knit rural community are going to be different from those in a specialized forensic setting, for example.
That makes sense.
And third, conflicts of interest, they go beyond just interpersonal relationships. They encompass any situation where a psychologist's other interests, whatever those might be,
Hmm.
could interfere with their professional judgment or potentially put their clients at risk of harm or exploitation.
And that thread that runs through all of this, it seems to be this constant awareness of anything that could affect a psychologist's objectivity, competence, effectiveness, and most importantly, the risk of any kind of exploitation or harm to the person seeking their help.
Absolutely. Those are the ethical cornerstones for navigating these sometimes murky waters.
I don't know about you, but I found this incredibly insightful. It's clear that navigating these ethical waters demands ongoing awareness, careful judgment, and a deep commitment to the well-being of those we serve. And for you, our listener, as you reflect on these guidelines, here's a thought to chew on. What subtle power dynamics might be at play in the various professional relationships we encounter in our everyday lives? And how could a greater awareness of those dynamics, even outside the realm of psychology, lead to more ethical interactions? Food for thought, right?
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.